So here's something wild to think about. Picture yourself not in some grand castle or banquet hall, but in a muddy, little medieval village. The kind of place where life isn't measured by years or seasons, but by the food you can put on the table that day. Forget the romantic scenes of knights feasting or kings tearing into roast swans. For most people, food was the constant struggle, the quiet battle in every household, every single day. What you ate or didn't eat shaped everything: your health, your work, your family's survival. And here's the shocking truth. Medieval villagers weren't eating the kinds of meals we imagine from paintings or stories. Their diet was rough, sometimes dangerous, often repetitive, and always uncertain. Every crumb mattered. Every harvest could make or break a year. Behind the quaint image of thatched roofs and narrow lanes was a reality where hunger sat just outside the door, waiting for a bad season to push its way in. So, settle in. Let yourself sink into your bed. Or your care, wherever you're listening. Take a slow breath, and let the modern world fade a little. Tonight, we'll be stepping back hundreds of years to see what food in a medieval village was really like. And by the end, you might never look at your pantry in quite the same way again. It's early morning, and your eyes open to the pale light slipping through tiny slits in the walls of your cottage. There's no glass in those windows, just wooden shutters, maybe covered with oiled cloth if you're lucky. The air is damp and chilly, smelling faintly of smoke, animals, and earth. You roll over on a straw mattress stuffed into a wooden frame or maybe just laid on the ground. Rushes cover the floor, and the fire pit in the center is little more than ash and a faint glow. Your stomach already aches. Hunger wasn't rare, it was routine. The first thought of most mornings wasn't what exciting meal you might eat, but whether there was anything left at all. If the harvest had been good last year, maybe you still had a small supply of dried beans, some salted fish, or a sack of grain tucked away. If not, the cupboard could be bare. And by cupboard, I don't mean shelves packed with food. It might just be a wooden chest where your family's entire supply for the winter was stored. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was usually bread. Heavy, dark, and dense. Baked from rye or barley. Wheat was a luxury. White bread was for nobles, not villagers. Sometimes that bread was stretched with whatever fillers you could manage: ground peas, beans, acorns, even sawdusts in times of famine. Imagine chewing that first thing in the morning. And here's the kicker. Rye often carried a fungus called ergot. It caused hallucinations, convulsions, even gangrene. Entire communities suffered outbreaks of what they called St. Anthony's fire, not realizing their bread was slowly poisoning them. If there was no bread left, you might have a bit of potajath in porridge made from oats or barley boiled with water. If your family was lucky, maybe you had some cabbage leaves or leeks to throw in. This was the everyday staple, bubbling in a pot over the fire, eaten again and again, morning and night. It didn't taste like much, but it filled the stomach, and filling the stomach was the point. Meat, forget about it. Chickens were too valuable for their eggs, and pigs were often kept until winter, slaughtered and preserved so the meat could last. Cows meant milk, butter, maybe a bit of cheese, if you had the patience and skill, but even those weren't guaranteed most of the time. Your protein came from beans and peas, not from roasted animals. Hunting wild game, like deer or boar, was strictly off-limit. Those animals belonged to the Lord, and if you were caught poaching, the punishment was brutal. So the meat you see in medieval feasts, that wasn't the life of a villager. For you, that was a fantasy. And yet, food shaped everything. The rhythm of the year was built around planting and harvesting. In spring, you prayed for good weather so seeds would take. In summer, you tended crops every day, weeding, watering, protecting. In autumn, you worked dawn to dusk, bringing in the grain, storing it, drying beans, salting fish, if you had any, and hanging herbs in the rafters. Winter was survive living of what you had managed to save, stretching every crumb, watching your supplies dwindle, and hoping they lasted until the next spring. When famine struck, things turned desperate. Too much rain, too little sun, one swarm of locusts, or one cold snap at the wrong time. An entire harvest failed. Villagers turned to desperate substitutes. Roots and weeds, boiled nettles, bark ground into powder. Bread might be patted with straw or crushed shells, just to give it bulk. People wasted away. Diseases swept through weakened bodies. Children starved. Elders perished. And entire villages shrank. Hunger wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a shadow that hovered constantly, always ready to strike. And yet, even in the hardest times, there were moments of community. Harvest festivals were more than celebrations, they were survival rituals. Everyone in the village came together, cutting grain, singing, sharing ale brewed fresh for the season. The last sheaf, the harvest all, was decorated and saved for luck, a promise that food would return on feast days, Christmas, Easter, or a Saint's Holiday. Lord might host a meal where villagers finally tasted meat, honey, or spice puddings. Those were days you remembered for the rest of the year, because they stood out against the endless cycle of bread, pottage, and hunger. So here you are, sitting in your smoky cottage, cradling a bowl of pot. It's thin, it's plain, it's what you have. You eat slowly, not because it's delicious, but because you know it needs to last. Tomorrow, the bowl might be emptier, the bread might be harder, and the hunger might bite deeper. And that was life in a medieval village built around food, and haunted by the fear of losing it. As the day unfolds, food stays at the center of everything. It isn't tea. Just something you do when you re-hungry it. It's the background to every task, every worry, every plan. After that meager breakfast, the rest of your morning is spent in the fields if the season allows. And the fields are everything. Grain wasn't just a crop, it was the foundation of survival. Without it, there was no bread, no pottage, no ale. Grain meant power. Lords collected it as rent, churches demanded it as tithe, and families prayed over every stalk. A poor harvest didn't just mean a linear, it meant you might not live to see the next one. And because grain was so essential, entire systems of life revolved around protecting, measuring, and storing it. Families built little raised granaries to keep rats out, but rats still found their way in. Mold crept in. A single wet season could spoil sacks in storage, leaving nothing but rot where hope should have been. Villagers didn't just eat grain, they drank Italiano. Ale wasn't optional, it was daily fuel. Water often carried disease, especially near villages where waste flowed into streams. Ale, even weak ale, was safer. Brewing wasn't a luxury hobby, it was survival science. Women brewed it in small batches, often in their cottages, serving it fresh before it spoiled. Children drank it too, not strong ale, but small ale, a weak version that still killed germs and gave calories. Imagine a world where beer was the breakfast drink, the lunch drink, the dinner drink. For medieval villagers, that was normal. Vegetables played a steady, if uninspiring, role. You grew hardy crops that could last. Cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans, turnips. Carrots existed, though they weren't the orange ones. We know tomatoes came centuries later. They were purple, yellow, even white. Everything went into the same pot, simmered into endless variations of pot. It wasn't fine dining, but it was reliable. Herbs gave a little variety: parsley, sage, dill, garlic. Salt was precious, often too costly for a peasant family, so most food was bland. Fruit was seasonal and fleeting. Apples, pears, cherries, berries, you ate them when they ripened, or you dried what you could to last through winter. Honey sweetened rare treats, but sugar. That was almost mythical, an exotic luxury carried by traders from faraway lands, reserved for the nobility or For villagers, sweetness came only in brief bursts. A stolen apple, a spoonful of honey. Protein, when it appeared, often came from fish. If you lived near rivers, eels and freshwater fish filled the gap. On the coast, salted herring or cod might appear in the village markets, but like everything else, access depended on money and permissions. Lords controlled rivers, monasteries owned fishing rights. Ordinary people took what scraps they could, drying or salting the catch when possible. Fish became even more central because of the church. Half the calendar was made of fasting days: Fridays, Lent, Adventuin. Meat was banned. On those days, fish, dairy, and vegetables took over completely. This wasn't just about religion, it shaped farming itself, because the church required so many meatless days. Demand for fish soared. Rivers were overfished, ponds were dug to farm fish, and salted barrels traveled hundreds of miles inland. Your diet wasn't just shaped by the soil under your feet, it was shaped by rules written in stone walls, miles away. And then there was the pig. If your family could keep one, it was like a living savings account. You fed it scraps, let it forage in the woods, fattening it up until the right moment. Usually in November, after harvest was done and cold weather made it easier to preserve meat, the village turned into a butchery. Slaughtering season wasn't just practical, it was communal. Families gathered, knives sharpened, smokehouses ready, every part of the pig was used. Meat was salted, smoked, or boiled down into thick stews. Fat became lard for cooking, intestines turned into sausages, even the bladder became a container or toy for children. Waste wasn't an option. This single animal had to stretch through the long, dark months ahead. Milk was precious too, but it didn't last long. Fresh milk spoiled fast, so it was churned into butter or made into cheese, something that could last weeks or months if carefully stored. For some, cheese became the only reliable protein in lean times. And butter wasn't just for eating. It lit lamps, greased tools, and even served as a kind of primitive medicine. The truth is, meals weren't separate events like we think of today. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, those neat divisions didn't exist. People ate when there was food. Often it meant 2 meals a day, sometimes just one. At midday, after hours of work, you might pause for bread, a little cheese, maybe a mug of ale. In the evening, when labor was finished and darkness pressed in, the main pot of pottage was shared by the family. That was the rhythm. Bread and ale, bread and cheese, bread and pottage, repeat, day after day. But hunger wasn't only about empty bellies. It was about class. What the Lord ate and what you ate weren't just different. They were worlds apart. At the manor table, meats roasted. Spices, fluid imported wine poured into goblets. For villagers, spices were stories, tales told by returning traders. Maybe once in a lifetime you tasted pepper or cinnamon. But mostly, seasoning meant onions or a pinch of salt. The gap between rich and poor was etched into every bite. And yet, even in this narrow diet, traditions blossomed. Feasts punctuated the year times, when villagers could taste what they normally only dreamed of. At Christmas, goose, or a joint of beef, might be shared, bread made richer with eggs and honey. At Easter, fresh greens signaled the return of life to the fields. Weddings, harvest fairs, or saints' days brought rare indulgence, roasted meats, sweetened cakes, overflowing ale. These weren't just meals, they were memories, anchors that carried you through the long monotonous stretches of thin porridge and hard bread. Still, those feasts were the exception. The daily reality was cautious, repetitive, and often unsatisfying. Every mouthful had a shadow the knowledge that next year's harvest might fail, that your stores might not last, that one sickness in the family could drain what little you had. Hunger wasn't a stranger, it was a constant companion, sometimes quiet, sometimes roaring. By late afternoon, you're back in your cottage, tired from work, ready for that one main meal. The fire is stoked, the pot is bubbling, and the family gathers. Pottage again. Bread again, maybe a little ale poured out into wooden mugs. Children slurp greedily. Adults eat slower, stretching what's there. There are no leftovers, no storage containers filled with tomorrow's food. Everything you eat is rationed with a thought of next week, next month, next spring. Every meal is a calculation, and as the darkness settles, as candles or rushlights flicker weakly against the walls, the family sits full enough for now. You've survived another day. Tomorrow, the work starts again. Now imagine the year isn't kind. The rains don't stop. Or maybe they never come. The harvest stew depended on shrivels in the fields or rots before it can be brought in. Suddenly, the steady rhythm of bread and pottage collapses. This was the nightmare that haunted medieval villagers, the arrival of famine. And it wasn't a rare event. It could strike once in a generation, sometimes more, reshaping entire communities in its wake. When famine came, food wasn't just scarce, it was dangerous. Families turned to substitutes that barely qualified as nourishment. Grains were stretched with whatever filler could be ground fine enough to bake. Acorns, bark, straw, even powdered earth were mixed into bread to give it bulk. These loaves were heavy, bitter, and sometimes toxic. Hunger dulled your senses, so you ate them anyway. People boiled nettles, dandelions, thistles, anything green and vaguely edible. Roots were dug up, some nourishing, others poisonous. Desperation blurred the line between food and poison. Diseases followed close behind. Malnutrition weakened bodies, and once the immune system faltered, sickness spread. Typhoid, dysentery, and fevers swept through villages. Children were the first to go, elders soon after. Families shrank. Entire villages emptied. Hunger wasn't just annoying in the belly, it was a scythe cutting through the population. One of the worst examples was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Heavy rains ruined crops across Europe. Fields turned to mud, grain rotted before it ripened, and livestock drowned in flooded pastures. Prices soared overnight. A loaf of bread that once cost a penny now cost 4. For villagers living on the edge already, that was impossible. People abandoned their homes to beg on roadsides. Reports told of parents forced to choose which children to feed. Chroniclers wrote darkly of people eating dogs, horses, even rumors of cannibalism in the worst places. Whether every tale was true or not, the fear it created was real. And yet, famine didn't always look like absolute emptiness. Sometimes, the food was there, but locked away. Lords still collected rents. Churches still demanded tithes. Grain might be stored in barns while villagers starved outside, forbidden from touching it. Hunger wasn't always about lack, it was often about power. And that imbalance left scars, not just in bodies, but in memory. People remembered the years when the earth betrayed them, and they passed those stories down like warnings. Still, even in famine, survival required ingenuity. Some villages banded together, sharing what little they had. Others relied on monasteries, which often kept larger grain stores and distributed bread to the desperate. Pilgrimages became more common in famine years, crowds walking miles to holy shrines, praying for miracles, hoping for handouts of food along the way. In those years, faith itself was a kind of nourishment, something to cling to when the stomach was empty. But famine wasn't just a matter of failed crops. It was also a cycle baked into the agricultural system. Winter and early spring were the hardest times, even in ordinary years. By then, last year's stores were nearly gone. Bread got thinner, pottage got weaker, animals had been slaughtered months ago. These were called the hungry months, when villagers lived on scraps, dried beans, or whatever green shoots could be found in fields. Sometimes, children starved just weeks before the new harvest arrived. To live in a medieval village was to exist in constant awareness of that seasonal trap. You might think, well, couldn't they just preserve food better? They treat smoking meat, salting fish, drying fruit. These methods helped, but they required surplus, and surplus wasn't common. Salt was expensive. Smokehouses needed resources. Drying racks meant planning. Most families lived harvest to harvest, never able to store enough for real security. A few families with better land or fewer mouths managed to keep a small reserve. But for most, winter and spring meant counting each grain, stretching each crust, and hoping for mercy. And then there were the strange survival foods, things you wouldn't imagine eating unless you had no choice. Families ground chestnuts into flour for bitter bread. They dug up wild turnips so hard and fibrous they had to be boiled for hours. Horses, when they died, were butchered for meat. Dogs and cats weren't spared in the worst years. Hunger stripped away the boundaries of what was acceptable. Anything that gave calories was swallowed. Yet through all this, food remained more than fuel. It carried meaning. A shared loaf of bread wasn't just nourishment. It was a bond. Families store it into pieces at the table, each person taking a portion, no one left out. That act of sharing became sacred, even in famine. When bread was black and heavy with fillers, dividing it still marked the family as whole. At the same time, hunger shaped morality. People judged one another for how they acted in lean times. A family that hoarded grain might be remembered bitterly for generations. A neighbor who shared a sack of beans could be spoken of with reverence long after their death. Food wasn't just survival, it was reputation, community, and legacy. And strangely, hunger also created rituals of hope. In some villages, the last handful of seed grain was never eaten, no matter how desperate things became. It was saved for planting, a promise to the future. To eat that seed was to give up on tomorrow. Parents taught their children this harsh lesson: no matter how empty your stomach, some things must be protected. Without them, the cycle of survival broke forever. So as the year rolls on, you can feel the rhythm of food not as abundance, but as scarcity. Every bite is measured, every portion weighed against time. A meal isn't just about what's on the table, it's about what might not be there tomorrow. Hunger shapes your body, your choices, your village's entire way of life. And that, more than castles or kings, is the real story of medieval food. Religion didn't just belief in medieval villages shape the menu. If you think of food as a daily rhythm, the church was a drummer setting the beat. Nearly half the year was marked by fasting rules, and these rules weren't optional. They applied to everyone, from peasants to nobles. On Fridays, on Lent, during Advent, on countless saints' days, meat was forbidden. For villagers, this meant that even if you had a pig or a chicken, you couldn't just slaughter it and eat. You followed the calendar, or you risked the church's wrath. Fish became the obvious replacement, but not everyone had rivers or access to the sea, so demand soared. Monasteries kept ponds stocked with fish, and lords controlled rivers and streams. Villagers without such access often relied on salted or dried fish brought in by traders. It wasn't glamorous. Imagine chewing on a strip of dried herring for the 50th time in a row, but it followed the rules, and rules kept you safe. And the rules went deeper. During Lent, dairy and eggs were often banned too. That meant no butter, no cheese, no milk, no eggs in your bread. Meals shrank down to vegetables, grains, and fish, if you could find it. Some families struggled through Lent more than any other time of year, because it came during the hungry months, just before the next harvest. Fasting wasn't a choice, it was layered on top of hunger. But fasting wasn't only about restriction, it also created rhythm, a sense of occasion. When the fast broke on Easter, for example, suddenly tables filled with richer foods. Fresh eggs, new greens, roasted meats. After weeks of absence, these foods tasted like miracles. The contrast made feasts feel extraordinary, even if they weren't as lavish as the meals of lords. And feasts mattered. The agricultural year gave villagers precious few moments of celebration, but when they came, food was at the center. At Christmas, the whole village might come together for a shared meal. Ale brewed specially for the season, a goose roasted over an open fire, bread enriched with honey or dried fruit. At harvest festivals, tables groaned under the weight of whatever the fields had given that year. These were times when even the poorest villagers might taste meat, feel full, and remember what abundance felt like. The church also made food symbolic. Bread wasn't just bread, it was holy. In Mass, the host became the body of Christ, linking the everyday act of eating with the divine. Grain wasn't only survival, it was spiritual. Wine too, though for villagers, wine was rare. Ale filled the cups of peasants, while wine filled the chalices of priests. Still, the message was clear. Food was sacred. Seasons shaped the menu just as strongly. Summer meant fresh beans, peas, greens, berries, apples. Autumn was harvest, when storage was replenished and butchering filled smokehouses. Winter was endurance salted meat, dried beans, roots from cellars. Spring was lean, a season of scraping by until fields turned green again. The same ingredients. Ober and ober, but always shifting with time. Think about how different this was from our world, where strawberries can be bought in January and oranges appear year. For medieval villagers, if it wasn't the season, it didn't exist. Food carried the taste of time itself. Apples in autumn, cabbage in winter, leeks in spring. Each bite reminded you of the cycle you were caught in. A circle bigger than you, older than you, and impossible to escape. And then there were the foods of celebration. The things you rarely saw, but remembered vividly. Spiced cakes, sweetened with honey, flavored with cinnamon or nutmeg, if a trader had passed through. Roasted meat dripping with fat, so filling you felt heavy afterward. A jug of ale that wasn't weak and watery but rich and strong. For a villager, these moments weren't just indulgence day, were proof that life wasn't only toil and hunger. They gave meaning to the endless cycle of planting, harvesting, and waiting. The Lord's table cast a long shadow here too. You knew what was eaten there, even if you never tasted it yourself. Exotic spices, white bread made from fine wheat, venison from hunts, wine imported from France. These meals were spectacles of power, reminders of the gulf between rich and poor. But sometimes, when the Lord celebrated, scraps were handed out to village. Bones, leftover loaves, even a skin of wine. A single taste of that world could linger in memory for months. Yet the village created its own traditions with what it had. Pancakes, made with leftover flour and eggs before Lent. Thick stews bubbling during cold feasts. Loaves blessed at harvest and broken among neighbors. These were rituals that tied food to time, to faith, to survival. Food wasn't just calories, it was memory, meaning, and hope. Picture a midsummer feast. Long tables set outdoors. Villagers gathered in the glow of a fading sun. Bread piled high, cheese wheels cut open, mugs of ale clinking together. A single roasted pig on a spit, turning slowly, the smell drifting across the fields. Children laughing, elders sharing stories, everyone full for one night. That memory would carry through the lean days of winter, a reminder that abundance existed, even if only briefly. But beneath all this, the truth remained. Food was fragile. One frost, one pest, one illness in the livestock, and the balance shattered. Religion gave rules, festivals gave rhythm, but hunger never disappeared. It lurked, patient, waiting for the next bad season. And villagers never forgot that. As night falls in your imagined village, the fast or feast of the day behind you, the pot hangs over the fire, bubbling low. Bread sits hard on the table. A mug of ale waits, weak but steady. You eat what's there, you thank God for it, and you hope for tomorrow. When you think about food in a medieval village, you have to remember that not everyone was eating the same thing. The gap between what a lord ate and what a villager ate was enormous. And it wasn't just about taste or comfort, it was about health, survival, and power. Food showed you exactly where. And so, the daily reality for most medieval villagers was a mix of caution, repetition, and hope. Bread baked hard and black, beans boiled into stews, ale brewed weak but steady. Meals were simple, but they were life itself. Each crumb, each sip, carried the weight of survival. The Lord's feasts might echo in the distance, but at your own table, survival was the only feast that mattered. As the day ends in your imagined village, you can almost hear the difference in meals. In the manor hall, laughter rises over the clatter of dishes, the smell of roasted meats drifting into the night. In your cottage, the fire burns low, the pot scraped clean, the family gathered in quiet. Both households eat, but the gulf between them is vast. And that gulf, marked in bread, in meat, in spices, the shocking truth of food in medieval life. Food in a medieval village wasn't just eaten, it had to be preserved, stretched, and guarded. Without preservation, the long months between harvests would have been impossible. Every family learned tricks passed down for generations, and yet, even the best planning often left gaps. Preservation wasn't foolproof. It was a fragile shield against hunger, one that could crack with a wet season, a rat infestation, or just plain bad luck. Salt was the most powerful tool, but also one of the most expensive. If you had access to salt, you could preserve fish, pork, or beef long enough to carry you through winter. Coastal villages sometimes had an advantage here, trading salty herring or cardinlan. Inland peasants often had less. A family might scrape together enough salt to preserve a single pig or a few cuts of meat, but not much more. For most, salted food was rare, almost a luxury. Smoking was another method. Families built simple smokehouses or used the rafters of cottages, hanging strips of meat above slow-burning fires. The smoke dried the flesh, added flavor, and kept rot at bay. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. Smoked bacon or sausage hanging in the beams was a common sight, and a comforting one, evidence that the family might make it through the leanest months. Drying was the simplest method. Apples sliced and spread on cloth in the sun, beans and peas left to shrivel on the vine, herbs tied in bundles and hung from rafters. These dried foods were easy to store, light to carry, and ready to throw into a pot of pottage when nothing else was available. Dried fruit, when rehydrated in winter, was a small taste of summer in the middle of the cold. Root vegetables had their own kind of preservation. Potatoes didn't exist in medieval Europe yet, but turnips, parsnips, carrots, and onions kept well when buried in cool cellars or pits. Families dug root cellars lined with straw or stored vegetables in earthen jars buried in the floor. These simple techniques kept vegetables edible deep into winter, though they grew softer, tougher, and less flavorful with time. Cheese was another lifeline. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, but once turned into cheese, it could last months. Villagers made simple soft cheeses for immediate use and harder ones to age. Cheese provided vital protein, especially in winter when animals were slaughtered and fresh milk was scarce. Butter, too, lasted longer in cooler months and could be stored in sealed containers. Both butter and cheese weren't just food, they were barter, items you could trade with neighbors when supplies ran low. But no matter how carefully food was preserved, there was always loss. Rats snored through sacks of grain. Mice found their way into cellars. Mold crept over cheese. Smokehouses burned down. Salted barrels spoiled if the seal was broken. A family's hard work could vanish overnight. That's why preservation wasn't just an individual act, it was communal. Villagers often worked together, sharing smokehouses, helping one another slaughter pigs, watching each other's stores when someone was away. Food preservation was survival, but it was also community. The cycle of seasons made this rhythm unavoidable. In spring, when stores were low, the first green shoots of cabbage, leeks, or peas were treasures. In summer, fresh produce filled the table, though it also had to be dried, salted, or smoked immediately. Autumn was the season of frantic labor. Harvests brought grain, fruits, and animals to slaughter, all of which had to be processed before the cold. Winter was endurance, relying on what had been saved, hoping it would last. This cycle wasn't gentle. It pressed down on every family, year after year. It created rituals and traditions, but also anxieties that never faded. Every bite of food carried a question. Will this last until spring? Will we have enough? And the answer was never certain. Communities leaned on each other to manage this uncertainty. When one family's stores ran low, neighbors shared what they could, knowing the favor would be returned someday. Harvest time was communal, with neighbors cutting each other's fields, bringing in grain before weather ruined it. The same went for butchering season, when families gathered to slaughter pigs and divide the labor of salting and smoking. Alone's survival was fragile. Together, it became possible. Monasteries and churches also played a role. They often had larger granaries, better storage, and more consistent supplies. In famine years, monasteries sometimes opened their stores to feed villagers, though not always freely. Bread was handed out at church doors, and almsgiving became a lifeline for the poorest. Religion gave not only rules, but also safety nets, however limited. Still, the struggle of preservation shaped the psychology of the village. Food wasn't just eaten, it was guarded. Families locked their stores, measured carefully, counted each loaf and bean. Children learned early that nothing could be wasted. A crust of bread was soaked in ale to soften it, a scrap of bacon boiled 3 times to flavor different meals. Bones simmered for broth until nothing remained. Waste wasn't simply frowned upon, it was dangerous. And because preservation required labor, it gave identity. Women often took the lead in drying, salting, and cheese. Men slaughtered animals, built cellars, chopped wood for smokehouses. Children gathered herbs, picked berries, guarded against animals. Everyone had a role, and failure by one could doom the whole family. Preservation wasn't optional, it was life's work. Imagine yourself in late autumn, standing in a smoky cottage. Sausages hang from beams, their skins glistening in the dim light. Bundles of herbs dangle overhead, dried stiff but still fragrant. Baskets of turnips and carrots line the wall, covered with straw. A barrel of salted pork rests in the corner, precious and heavy. Outside, grain lies stacked in the Lord's barn, a reminder of what you gave up to pay rent. Inside, your stores are modest but enough if managed with care. The smell of smoke, the sight of drying food, gives you comfort. It means survival, at least for now. As winter deepens, these stores shrink. Each week, another string of sausages disappears, another basket of vegetables empties. Bread grows harder, beans fewer. Hunger whispers, louder. Preservation buys time, but time always runs out. That's the truth villages lived with. Preservation wasn't a victory, it was a pause in the endless struggle. And yet, in that fragile pause, in those smokehouses and cellars, there was a kind of triumph. Human hands, working together, had found ways to hold back hunger, even if only temporarily. The smell of smoked meat, the taste of aged cheese, the sight of a full root cellar, these weren't just practical. They were reminders of resilience, of knowledge passed down, of community strength. Preservation didn't defeat hunger, but it delayed it. And in the medieval village, delay was survival. So now you've walked through the meals of a medieval village. The bread that was black and heavy, the pottage bubbling day after day, the rare bite of meat, the weak ale poured into a wooden mug. You've seen the way preservation was less about comfort and more about survival. How fasting and feasting bent every meal to the rhythm of the church calendar. How famine lingered like a shadow at the edge of every field. And in all of this, food wasn't just food. It was the axis around which the whole village turned. Think about how many hours each person spent every day just to keep hunger away. Women tending fires, stirring pots, drying herbs, churning butter. Men slaughtering animals, building smokehouses, hauling sacks of grain. Children gathering berries, guarding stores, learning early not to waste a crumb. A meal wasn't just eating, it was the work of the entire family, the entire community, the entire year. And food was memory. Families remembered the hard winters when the grain spoiled, the years when ergot poisoned the bread, the harvest festivals when the tables were full and no one went hungry. Memory made every loaf sacred, every feast more vivid. A piece of bread wasn't just bread, it was survival pressed into your hands. For villagers, food also meant belonging. Sharing a pot of pottage at the hearth tied families together. Lending a sack of beans or a few eggs to a neighbor created bonds stronger than words. Feasts weren't just celebrations, they were acts of community, a chance to remind everyone that survival wasn't a solo effort. A single roast goose or jug of ale shared at Christmas carried more meaning than a lord's entire banquet. But hunger was the teacher that never left. It taught caution, thrift, humility. It shaped the rhythms of life, the size of families, the strength of villages. It reminded every generation that survival was never guaranteed. That, behind the warm glow of feasts, behind the memory of laughter at festivals, there was always the possibility of empty fields, empty stores, and empty stomachs. And yet, people endured. That's what makes the story of medieval food so striking. Not the feasts of nobles, not the spices carried from far-off lands, but the quiet resilience of villagers. They endured the monotony of pottage, the risk of famine, the weight of fasting. They endured by preserving, by sharing, by adapting, and in that endurance, they created traditions that outlasted them. Close your eyes and picture the cycle one last time. Spring, when green shoots rise in fields, and the first fresh vegetables return to the table, fragile and precious. Summer, when gardens and orchards burst with fruit, when grain sways tall and golden, promising bread for another year. Autumn, when families bend their backs to harvest, when pigs are slaughtered and smoke fills the air, when root cellars are stocked and barns filled. Winter, when the fire burns low, when bread is rationed, when beans and roots stretch through the cold, when hunger sits close but is held back by human hands. Then spring again, the cycle renewed. For medieval villagers, food was life, death, and everything in between. It was faith and fear, community and control. It was the difference between joy and despair. And even though centuries have passed, even though our cupboards are fuller, our tables richer, the shadow of their struggles still lingers. Every loaf of bread, every feast, every fast has roots that stretch back to those muddy cottages, those smoky fires, those villagers who measured survival one meal at a time. So tonight, as you rest, think of that world. The smoky air of a cottage, the rough crust of barley bread, the bubbling pot of pottage hanging over the fire. Think of families gathered around, tired from the fields, grateful for what little they had. Think of hunger waiting outside, but kept at bay by smoke, salt, and shared labor. Think of the rhythm of seasons, the cycle of fasting and feasting, the memory of famine and the hope of harvest. And maybe, just maybe, you'll see food differently. Not just as flavor, not just as choice, but as the thread that ties us to the past. Because the shocking truth of food in medieval villages isn't just that it was scarce, repetitive, or dangerous. The shocking truth is that it shaped everything: work, faith, community, survival. Without it, there was no life. With it, even in its simplest form, people endured. As you let yourself drift towards sleep, let that thought settle. The clatter of spoons in a wooden bowl, the smell of smoke and herbs, the warmth of bread fresh from a clay oven, the simple comfort of food, fragile and precious. The villagers of the past found rest in it, even when it was thin and plain. And now, hundreds of years later, you can rest in the knowledge of their endurance, their resilience, their survival. Your breathing slows. The cycle of seasons continues, as it always has. Hunger fades for now, and like the villagers who ate their bread carefully, who watched their fields anxiously, who endured and carried on, you too can let go for the night, full not of food, but of their story.